The year was 1944. Across the Atlantic, the world was burning. Cities reduced to rubble, empires collapsing, and soldiers scattered like ashes in the wind. But far from the front lines, behind barbed wire and guard towers, lay a different kind of battlefield, one fought not with bullets, but with dignity, humanity, and disbelief. Inside a U.S. prisoner of war camp somewhere in the heart of America, hundreds of wary German soldiers awaited the unknown. Captured after months of fighting, they had prepared themselves for hunger, humiliation, and punishment. That's what they expected. But on this cold, clear morning, something else awaited them. As the morning bugle echoed through the still air, the gates to the mess hall opened, and the smell hit first. Bacon, fresh bread, fried eggs. The scent was almost unreal, for men who had survived on watery soup and crusts of bread on the front. The aroma alone was an assault on everything they believed about their captors. They stepped in slowly, boots clacking on polished floors, eyes scanning trays filled with warm food meant for them. In that moment, the war seemed to pour orders. No ranks, just men hungry and stunned, trying to understand why the enemy would feed them like this. This was the day German prisoners first saw an American breakfast. And nothing, not even the propaganda of war, had prepared them for what they saw next. The morning of that day began like any other in the camp, cold, orderly, and silent. It was early in 1944, somewhere deep inside the American countryside, where endless rows of pine trees guarded the horizon and mist rolled low over the fields. The war in Europe was still raging, but here, behind layers of barbed wire and watchtowers, time seemed to move slower. The German prisoners of war had been brought to this camp weeks earlier. Men who once marched through cities under banners of conquest, now reduced to weary silhouettes in faded uniforms. For days they had eaten little more than thin soup and coarse bread, rations that reminded them of the front lines, of mud and hunger. Every morning they lined up, received their portions, and returned to their bunks in silence. Discipline, even in captivity, was all they had left. None of them expected that this morning would be any different. But from the moment the camp awoke, there was something unusual in the air. The first sign came from the smell, faint at first, drifting through the cold dawn air like a ghost of home. A few men noticed it as they stood in line for roll call. It wasn't the usual earthy odor of boiled vegetables or burnt bread. It was warm, rich, and almost sweet. One man lifted his head slightly, sniffing the air as if trying to capture a memory. "Speck," he whispered, the German word for bacon. The others laughed quietly, shaking their heads. Bacon was something they hadn't seen in years. It couldn't be possible. The Americans, they thought, wouldn't waste their good food on prisoners. Not them. Not the enemy who had bombed their cities and fought their sons. But the smell grew stronger. The faint crackle of oil on metal echoed from the mess hall, followed by the unmistakable hiss of frying eggs. Some of the younger soldiers glanced at each other, uncertain whether to feel hungry or suspicious. They were used to orders barked at them, not to surprises like this. As the bugle sounded for breakfast, a low murmur passed through the ranks. The line formed, boots crunching on frosted gravel. Guards stood by, their expressions neutral. No one spoke much. The air carried a tension that wasn't hostile, just confused, like everyone was waiting for someone to explain what was happening. The German prisoners marched toward the mess hall, a long wooden building that looked more like a farm barn than a military structure. Through the high windows, They could see faint shafts of light reflecting off metal trays and rising steam. Some slowed their pace as they approached, their breath visible in the cold air. Inside, American cooks worked behind counters, moving briskly but calmly, pouring coffee, flipping eggs, laying out rows of toast and fruit. There was no mockery in their faces, no cruelty, just routine. For them it was another morning, but for the men about to walk in, it was a moment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. When the doors opened, the first group of German POWs stepped inside. The warmth of the building wrapped around them instantly, the smell of fried eggs, bacon, and fresh bread filling their lungs. The contrast was overwhelming. Some blinked, squinting against the sunlight streaming through the dusty windows. Others stopped entirely, frozen in disbelief. Laid out before them were long tables covered with metal trays, each one filled with food. Real food. The kind they hadn't seen since before the war began. Fried eggs with bright yellow yolks, strips of crisp bacon, soft buttered rolls, steaming mugs of coffee, and glass bottles filled with fresh milk. Everything looked impossibly clean, organized, and abundant. For a moment, not one man moved. They simply stared. One of the older prisoners, a sergeant from Bremen, crossed himself instinctively, muttering something under his breath. Another shook his head and whispered, "Das ist unglitch." This is impossible. They had been told that Americans were cruel, that prisoners were starved, beaten, and humiliated. That was what the propaganda back home said. Yet here, they were being served the kind of breakfast their own civilians hadn't tasted in years. The American officer in charge gave a short nod, signaling them to move forward. Slowly, the line advanced. Each man took a tray from the counter, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from confusion. They moved as if in a dream, each step hesitant, eyes darting from the food to the guards, waiting for some kind of command to stop. None came. They reached the serving tables. An American cook, young, with sleeves rolled up and a faint smile, handed out portions one by one, scrambled or fried. He asked in a friendly tone. The words hung in the air like music none of the prisoners could understand, but somehow felt deeply. One by one, they received eggs, bacon, toast. The clang of metal trays echoed softly, steady and rhythmic. The German soldiers sat down at long wooden benches, rows upon rows of them, each man staring down at the food in front of him as though it were a trick. No one touched anything at first. The only sounds were the soft hum of the overhead fans and the distant cawing of crows outside. A few looked up toward the guards, half expecting someone to shout, to snatch the food away, to laugh at them for believing. But the guards simply stood by the walls, calm and watchful, hands resting on belts, their expressions unreadable. Then came a small movement, the first man to eat. He was young, barely 20, his uniform still neat despite weeks of captivity. He hesitated, fork trembling slightly in his hand, then pierced a piece of bacon and brought it to his lips. The taste hit him instantly, salt, smoke, and warmth. He froze, eyes closing. For a second, he seemed to forget where he was. He took another bite, then another. The man beside him, an older corporal, followed suit, cutting into his eggs. The yolk ran across the tray, bright and golden. Soon, the sound of utensils filled the room, cautious at first, then steady. It was as if a spell had been broken. The disbelief began to melt away, replaced by something else, gratitude, confusion, even guilt. Some of the men ate slowly, savoring every bite as though they were afraid it would be their last. Others ate quickly, unable to stop, hunger and emotion overwhelming them. A few sat quietly staring at their trays, too stunned to eat at all. The air changed. The room that had been silent moments ago now buzzed softly with whispers and murmurs. Words like unbelievable, "we-so," "why," floated through the air. A few of the Americans exchanged glances. They could see it, the disbelief on the prisoners' faces. For them, this wasn't a grand gesture, it was simply the standard meal served to every man in uniform. But for the prisoners, it was something profound. It was a crack in the wall that divided enemy from human. One of the German NCOs, tall, with a deep scar across his cheek, finally looked up and met the eyes of an American guard. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, neither smiling nor speaking. Then the German nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, and went back to his meal. Outside, the sunlight grew brighter. Through the narrow windows, the camp's fences glimmered faintly in the morning light, and the frost began to melt from the ground. By the time the breakfast ended, the mess hall had changed. The fear, the stiffness, the invisible tension, all had softened. When the men stood to return their trays, they did so quietly, orderly, but with a different kind of silence, not the silence of despair, but of reflection. As they stepped back into the cold, some of them looked toward the American flag fluttering over the camp. It no longer seemed like a symbol of the enemy, just a reminder of where they were, and how strange war could be. For the guards, it was just another morning in another camp. For the prisoners, it was a moment that would live in memory. The morning they realized that their captors could be both soldiers and men of compassion. In the years to come, many of them would remember that breakfast not for the food itself, but for what it represented. That even in war, humanity could survive. For a long and fragile minute, silence ruled the room. The German prisoners sat in rows, unmoving, eyes fixed on the trays before them. You could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, the soft hiss of steam from the kitchen, and the distant caw of a crow somewhere beyond the barbed wire fence. But inside the mess hall, time seemed suspended. No one spoke. No one dared. The war had taught them that kindness was a weakness, that mercy was rare, that the enemy did not feed you. He used you. Yet here they were, staring down at a meal fit for a soldier, not a captive. It was a strange kind of tension, not of fear, but of disbelief. These men had fought in the snows of Russia, in the hedgerows of France, and in the deserts of North Africa. They had seen brutality, starvation, and comrades die beside them. They had been taught that the Americans were arrogant, cruel, and merciless. Every bit of propaganda drilled into them back home had painted the Allies as monsters. But this scene shattered everything they thought they knew. The first to move was a young man sitting near the end of the table. His name had been called out earlier that morning during roll call. Oberstleutnant Hans Keller, barely 20 years old, captured in Normandy 2 months before. His uniform still bore the insignia of a once proud division, but his face carried the exhaustion of a man twice his age. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the fork. The others watched him from the corners of their eyes. The simple act of lifting that utensil felt monumental. He hesitated, glancing briefly toward one of the guards who stood near the wall, his expression unreadable. Then, almost defiantly, Keller took a bite of the scrambled eggs. The taste was immediate, warm, rich, and familiar in a way that almost hurt. For a brief moment, his mind was no longer in the camp. He was home in Stuttgart, at his mother's table before the war began. He could smell the same eggs frying in butter. hear the faint crackle of bacon, the laughter of his sisters. His throat tightened. He swallowed hard. When he looked up again, the guard hadn't moved. No one had shouted. No one had struck him. So he took another bite, then another. Slowly, as if testing the reality of the moment, the others began to follow. One soldier broke a piece of bread and dipped it into the yolk of his egg. Another raised a steaming mug of coffee to his lips, eyes closing as he tasted it. Soon, the stillness began to break apart, first with the quiet clink of utensils, then a murmur, then another. The sound grew, a soft chorus of men rediscovering what it meant to eat without fear. It wasn't loud, not joyous, but full of awe. Some smiled faintly, unable to hide it. Others bowed their heads, whispering brief prayers. One man, older and thin, simply held his fork in midair, staring at it as tears welled in his eyes. He didn't eat right away. He couldn't. His mind was somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. At the far end of the hall, an American guard leaned slightly against the wall, watching. He had seen battle too, North Africa, Italy, and he knew what hunger looked like. The way these men ate reminded him of the refugees he'd seen along dusty roads in Europe. People who'd lost everything but still carried themselves with quiet dignity. He didn't feel pity. He felt something more complex, recognition. The kind that comes when soldiers on opposite sides realize they've both been crushed by the same war. As the prisoners ate, their conversation grew just a little louder. It wasn't in celebration, it was curiosity. They spoke in low German tones, their voices echoing softly under the wooden beams. "Do they eat like this every day?" one asked. "I think so," another replied. "Americans have everything, eggs, meat, sugar." "We were told they starved their people with rationing." "It's not true." Someone further down the table added bitterly, "We fought for the fatherland while our children starved. And they live like this." But there was no anger in his words, only a quiet, aching wonder. A few of the prisoners even chuckled, shaking their heads. The absurdity of it all, to be the defeated, yet treated like guests at the breakfast table of their enemies, was too much to comprehend. At one table, an older non-commissioned officer with a weathered face and grey at his temples lifted his cup of coffee carefully. He sniffed it, uncertain, then took a slow sip. His eyes widened slightly. "It's real," he whispered to himself. "Real coffee, not ersatz." Ersatz, the bitter substitute drink that had replaced real coffee in Germany for years. To taste the genuine thing again was like drinking a memory. He looked toward the American cook behind the counter, a stocky man with a clean apron and a cigarette tucked behind his ear. For a moment, their eyes met. The cook gave the faintest of nods, a simple gesture that said, "Yes, it's real, and it's for you." The officer nodded back, lowering his gaze quickly. Pride still lingered like a shadow, but beneath it something softer stirred, respect. Not everyone ate freely. A few men sat still, refusing to touch their trays. Their eyes were cold, guarded. To them, accepting food from the enemy felt like surrendering a part of their identity. They had been raised on discipline and obedience, on loyalty to an idea that no longer held power here. One of them muttered under his breath, "They are trying to soften us, to make us forget." But the truth was, hunger had already stripped them of illusions. And as the scent of warm bread and coffee filled the air, even the hardest among them found their resolve slowly crumbling. Minutes passed. The mess hall now buzzed with quiet activity. The clatter of cutlery and the low hum of conversation mixed with the smell of bacon grease and roasted coffee beans. The sunlight, now stronger, streamed through the windows and glinted off the metal trays, casting tiny reflections that danced across the faces of the men eating. The guards stayed still, saying little. They knew that this meal meant more than nutrition. It was symbolic. These men, soldiers who once fought fiercely under the German flag, were learning that mercy could exist even within the fences of a POW camp. One of the guards, a corporal from Iowa, whispered to another, "Look at 'em. You'd think they hadn't eaten in a month." His partner shrugged. "Maybe they haven't. Let 'em eat." No one in the hall realized it at the time, but that morning was doing something subtle. It was reshaping perception. Each forkful of food, each sip of coffee, was dismantling layers of indoctrination built by years of war and propaganda. These men had been told that Americans were savages. But what kind of savage serves breakfast with milk and butter to his prisoners? By the time the plates were half empty, the emotional weight of the moment began to show. Some men leaned back, resting their forks, staring into space with glassy eyes. For the first time in years, their stomachs were full. The simple act of being fed with dignity, not as enemies, but as men, left them speechless. One soldier, perhaps feeling overwhelmed, placed his hands over his face and began to sob quietly. No one mocked him. They all understood. The sound of quiet weeping in that room was more powerful than any speech. It wasn't just about food. It was about being seen, being treated as human again. Even the Americans seemed to feel it. The cooks moved more gently now, their movements slower, almost reverent. The guards no longer looked like sentinels, but witnesses to something quietly extraordinary. When the meal was nearly over, a strange thing happened. One of the Germans, a tall man with sharp blue eyes and a calm demeanor, stood up and raised his hand slightly. The room quieted. He spoke in broken English, his accent thick but his tone sincere. "Thank you," he said softly, turning toward the kitchen staff. "For breakfast." The Americans didn't respond at first, surprised by the gesture. Then one of the cooks nodded and said simply, "You're welcome." It was a short exchange, no applause, no smiles, but it echoed deep in every man present. It was a spark of humanity flickering in the ruins of war. As the men began clearing their trays, the feeling of disbelief lingered, but it had changed flavor. What had begun as suspicion had become something closer to reflection. They carried their trays carefully, as if afraid to break the spell. When they left the mess hall, stepping into the cold morning light once more, they were quieter than when they'd entered. In the following days, that breakfast became a story told again and again among the prisoners. Some still refused to believe it was real. Others spoke of it as proof that not all enemies were the same. It became a small legend inside the camp. The morning the Americans fed us like their own. What none of them realized was how deeply that morning had affected the Americans too. For many of the young guards and cooks, it was the first time they'd seen the enemy up close, not as faceless soldiers, but as men with hunger, grief, and hope in their eyes. The war had dehumanized both sides. That breakfast, in its quiet simplicity, reminded everyone that humanity could still break through the cracks. Long after the meal was over, the smell of bacon and coffee lingered faintly in the air. Some prisoners could still taste it hours later, as if their senses refused to let go of something pure. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of uniforms, pride and loss, a realization began to take root. That compassion, even from an enemy, could be stronger than fear. The breakfast that morning had become more than a simple meal. It had become a subtle turning point. What began as disbelief had shifted into a quiet, simmering reflection. The German prisoners, who had been taught that their captors were cruel and unyielding, now sat among the remnants of a breakfast that had nourished not only their bodies but their sense of humanity. Even as the trays were cleared and the steam from the eggs and coffee dissipated into the morning air, a profound stillness settled over the mess hall, as if the very walls were absorbing the weight of the moment. As they filed out, each man carried something more than an empty tray. Some carried astonishment, some cautious gratitude, and some an unfamiliar warmth. A recognition that the world was not as black and white as they had been taught to believe. The tall barbed wire fences that surrounded the camp no longer seemed solely to imprison them. In the soft glow of the morning sunlight, the lines of separation between captor and captive blurred, if only for a fleeting moment. Soldiers who had once been enemies now shared a silent understanding that beneath the uniforms and the badges, they were all human beings enduring the same war. The days stretched on, but the memory of that morning remained vivid. Men walked to their barracks more slowly than usual, heads lowered in contemplation. Some glanced at the American flags fluttering softly in the breeze, eyes narrowing, not in suspicion but in thought. They remembered the crackling of frying bacon, the smell of coffee, and the soft golden yolks of eggs they had barely dared to imagine could be theirs. And they wondered how their world had changed so completely in the span of a single meal. In the barracks, the conversations were hushed but meaningful. Soldiers spoke in low tones, recounting details of the breakfast to comrades who had not been first in line. One man described the crispness of the bacon and the richness of the eggs. Another spoke of the creamy milk that he had poured over his bread. They spoke less about the war they had fought and more about the small, unexpected kindnesses they had been shown. There was a lingering disbelief, as if the acts of generosity they had witnessed were almost a form of magic, something too good to be real in a world defined by conflict. Outside, the camp hummed with routine. Guards moved along the perimeter, their eyes sharp, yet softened by what they had observed. The American cooks and officers continued with their duties, unaware of the magnitude of what they had facilitated. They saw it simply as a meal, ordinary, necessary. But for the German prisoners, it had become a marker of memory, a story that would ripple quietly through the ranks for weeks to come. The breakfast had planted a seed, one that suggested perhaps there was more to life than survival, more to war than victory or defeat. Over the following days, the prisoners began to reflect on their circumstances differently. They noticed the order and cleanliness of the camp, the care taken in the distribution of meals, and the attentiveness of the American personnel. These were details that might have gone unnoticed in harsher conditions, but now they were amplified, meaningful. Every act of thoughtfulness, a hot meal, a cup of coffee, a nod of acknowledgement, carried weight. It spoke louder than any words of propaganda, louder than the drills and routines of the camp, louder than the stories they had been told about the enemy's cruelty. In quiet moments between meals, soldiers found themselves thinking of home, of family, and of life before the war. They compared these memories to the unexpected kindnesses they had experienced and found themselves questioning long-held assumptions. Perhaps their enemies were not entirely what they had been told. Perhaps humanity could exist even in the shadow of barbed wire and conflict. These reflections did not erase the reality of the war outside the camp, but they softened it, created cracks in the rigid walls of ideology and fear that had been built over years of fighting. One afternoon, a small group of prisoners lingered near the mess hall, watching as American cooks cleaned and prepared for the next meal. There was a quiet fascination in the way they worked, precise, steady, without malice. The German soldiers whispered among themselves, noting the small details, how the trays were stacked neatly, how the utensils were arranged, how the food was prepared with care. Each observation carried an undercurrent of astonishment, as if they were discovering a new world within the confines of the camp. The act of feeding them had been simple, but the implications were vast. They were beginning to understand that respect, civility, and kindness were not exclusively the domain of allies, but could emerge from unexpected quarters. As the weeks passed, this understanding deepened. The memory of that first breakfast became a quiet legend among the prisoners. Not a tale of surrender or weakness, but a narrative of shared humanity. It was repeated in whispers in the barracks, described in detail to those who had been absent, and recalled in moments of reflection when fear or despair threatened to dominate the day. The act of being fed with dignity had altered their perspective. It reminded them that even in captivity, the essence of what it meant to be human could endure. The mess hall, once merely a place for sustenance, transformed in memory into a symbol. It represented the possibility of decency in a world ravaged by conflict, a place where soldiers could experience kindness from those who moments before were considered enemies. The tables, the trays, the simple food, eggs, bacon, bread, coffee, were not just nourishment, they were proof that civility could exist even in the midst of chaos. This realization subtly changed how the prisoners conducted themselves in the camp, how they interacted with one another, and how they perceived their captors. Even the guards and American personnel noticed a shift. The soldiers who had once been wary of every glance from a prisoner found themselves receiving fewer challenges and more trust. The atmosphere in the camp, while still defined by rules and necessity, softened in tone. The unspoken understanding born from a single breakfast began to permeate the daily routine, creating a delicate balance between authority and mutual respect. It was a transformation rooted not in power or fear, but in the quiet, profound act of feeding a man with dignity. For the prisoners, these lessons were subtle but enduring. They carried them in small ways. A polite nod, a measured tone when speaking with guards, a sense of shared experience with comrades. The memory of breakfast lingered like a touchstone, a reminder that even in times of war, human kindness could manifest in simple, tangible ways. It was not a cure for the hardships of captivity, nor did it erase the pain of separation from home or the anxiety of an uncertain future. But it was a moment of clarity, a revelation that even enemies could demonstrate empathy, that even in a world defined by conflict, humanity could survive. When they finally left the mess hall that day, the German prisoners were no longer the same men who had entered. Their bodies had been nourished, yes, but more importantly, their minds and hearts had been awakened to the possibility of something greater than survival. The recognition that compassion could exist even amidst conflict, that the enemy could be capable of respect, and that a simple act of kindness could leave a lasting imprint on a soul. From that day forward, whenever the prisoners spoke of meals in the camp, it was not merely about the food. They spoke of the dignity it represented, the unexpected generosity, and the quiet lessons learned over breakfast. Each man carried with him a fragment of understanding that would endure far beyond the fences of the camp, far beyond the duration of the war itself. It was a testament to the enduring power of humanity, a lesson that even in captivity, even amidst the harshest circumstances, kindness could shine through, subtle yet transformative.